Welcome to the Managing Violence Podcast, helping to make communities safer by providing education in how to prevent, prepare, respond, and recover from violence in all its forms. Your host is an expert in violence and aggression management. Here is Joe Saunders.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Managing Violence Podcast. I know it's been a minute, I'm a little bit behind schedule, but look, life is busy and business is good, which is which is always a nice thing. I'm flat out. I'm busy. I'm consulting. I'm training. I'm speaking. I'm doing lots of good things that I enjoy doing. But unfortunately, the downside to that is I just haven't had as much time to record the podcast as I would like. I'm going to try to make it up to you. No promises, unfortunately. I do have a couple of weeks coming up over Christmas where I'll be free, but I'll be trying to catch up with my family, who I haven't seen as much as I would like. But I will try to batch record a couple of episodes and drip them out over the new year when things start to get busy again. So I do apologize, and I thank you very much for your patience in waiting for me to release episodes. Moving forward, look, I do expect that I probably won't be sticking to a set time frame. I'm going to try to keep it around every 2 weeks, but I just can't promise. It's not my permanent gig, guys. This doesn't produce an income for me. It's purely a passion project. So on that, I'll do my best to honor the commitment and respect the loyalty that my listeners have shown. But unfortunately, I just can't make any promises that I'll definitely have it out every second Friday or every Friday as we have done previously. I will do my best, though. You have my word on that. So today we're doing something just a little bit different, or something we haven't done for quite a while. So rather than have a guest on today, what I've decided to do is to go through a topic that's near and dear to my heart, which is workplace aggression and organizational approaches to managing customer aggression and workplace violence, and sort of talk you through some of the most common mistakes that I've seen organizations make when they have otherwise good intentions, but poor execution when it comes to managing and tackling customer aggression and workplace violence. So without going into my full background, it's important for you to know that these observations really come about from quite a varied work history. So my between jobs I've done and worked in when I was starting out in the workplace through to companies I've consulted to over the years, some of the industries that I'm drawing these observations from include hospitality, liquor retail, private security, hotel and resort industries, so 5-star resorts, etc. Hospitals and healthcare, human services, community support roles such as social work and drug and alcohol in the community, etc. Travel and aviation, the funeral industry, so the funeral directors, undertakers, etc. Service stations, so that's gas stations for those in the US, or any other late night retail kind of falls into that category as well. Fast food, banking, utilities and infrastructure, government service centres, so customer-facing roles within local councils or different government organisations, and also enforcement activities such as parking inspectors, waste management, council, refuge centre workers, etc. that interact with the public. So that's a pretty broad spectrum. It touches on most customer-facing industries. There's a few I'd still like to work with, but it gives you an idea that I'm not just talking about healthcare. I'm certainly not just talking about law enforcement or corrections or any sort of authoritarian role, but I'm talking about the service industry and anyone who interacts with the public as a part of their regular job. So what I found is that all of these industries, they have their own issues with customer aggression and workplace violence. There's no one industry that's never touched by it, because anyone who interacts with people will occasionally interact with people that are angry, that are upset, that are otherwise antisocial or dysfunctional in how they manage their emotions, and sometimes they'll be taken out on your staff, and that's just a reality. So to their credit, I've never once had a client or worked for someone who just did not care that their staff are being assaulted or abused. Like no one's ever been completely callous about it or just decided this isn't an issue worth worth any investigation or any consultation. This is just a non-issue. People just need to get on with it. There is sometimes that perceived approach, especially in the workforce. People can feel that my manager doesn't care about me or the company doesn't care about me. But certainly with the ones that I've spoken to, I've never had that actually stated to me. So that said, if everybody considers it an issue, if all the management and senior executives consider it an issue and they all want to do something about it, why isn't it working? And that's what I'm going to bring you to today. So I've narrowed it down to about 7 key mistakes that I see that are routine, that happen over and over in otherwise well-meaning organizations that can completely sabotage an otherwise good program for managing workplace violence and aggression. So I'm going to go through a 7-point list of the most common mistakes that organizations make when tackling customer aggression. All right, are you ready to go? Because I'm ready to go. So the first one is incredibly obvious to all of us who have a heartbeat and brain cells, but not always obvious to those that are running large government organizations. And I apologize for my government clients that have just heard me say that, but I'm a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but as I tell you what the mistake is, you'll probably understand the context. So the first most common mistake that I come across is thinking a position statement is enough. So a position statement is essentially a drafted response to a particular incident or situation where there'll be something on the lines of such and such organization has a zero tolerance policy for aggressive, threatening, or intimidating behavior in our workplace. And that's it. It'll be a statement that says we do not tolerate it. We have zero tolerance for aggression or threatening or intimidating behavior. And then nothing. Crickets. That will be the end of it. We've got a well-drafted statement which is applaudable, if not actionable, because realistically, no one ever has a zero tolerance. There's always a certain amount of tolerance, or else you just close down business and stop seeing people. But we write these sort of statements, but then we don't back it up with any enforcement activities. We don't offer any extra support to our staff. There's no training plan that's following it. There's no follow-up on reported incidents. So people go, oh, great. Okay, I've got to report violence and aggression because we have a zero tolerance policy now. And then they report the violence and aggression, but because there's been no funding put into their support teams, there's no one there to follow up the reports. So all it communicates to the staff members is that the position statement was fluff. It was media. It was PR. It was just designed to get someone out of the frying pan and make it look like they're actually doing something and taking this issue seriously, which does very, very little for morale, let alone safety. The other thing is there's no investigations team stood up, so there's no one to actually react to reports of violence or aggression. There's no change to their employee assistance programs. There's no change in company culture. Really, look, guys, the gist of this is a position statement is not enough. You need action. If you're going to release a position statement, make sure the position statement is in support of an intended action plan. Outline that action plan and start working towards the actions that you've identified. I can't stress it enough. You need to take action. Position statements are great, but they do nothing on their own. Policy does not change behavior. Culture changes behavior. And the only way you change culture is through ongoing interaction and putting your money where your mouth is. So that's the first one. A position statement is not enough. I hope you guys are enjoying the traffic sounds, by the way. I normally record these either very early in the morning or very late at night so that I avoid all the traffic sounds that are just outside my office. But today I'm a little bit stretched. I'm recording in the middle of the day, and therefore you are getting the wonderful ambience of trucks going past and cars beeping their horns. So again, I apologize, but these are the lengths I need to go to get a podcast out at the moment. So I hope it's not too distracting as we move on to number 2. So the second mistake, and these are not in any order of importance or commonality or anything like that. It's just brainstorming the common mistakes I see. So the second mistake to draw your attention to is ad hoc training. Now, ad hoc being an inconsistent training. This is a very, very common issue. Now, obviously, I'm a big fan of training. I do a lot of training. I conduct a lot of training. I do ad hoc training as requested. If people need a workshop or something like that, I'll come in and I'll do a one-time only if that's all there's an appetite for. But it isn't optimal. Look, I think every human being on the planet should have to do some sort of mandatory training for conflict management. So, I mean, look, even if it's just verbal, how to talk your way out of a situation, how to de-escalate, how to understand why people get upset, how they get upset, what we do that upsets people so we can recognize those things, understanding what triggers people's behavior, and how we can recognize that and start putting measures in place to control escalation of aggression. I think that's all brilliant stuff. I think that, along with basic first aid and basic self-defense, should be taught in high school. Because at the end of the day, the only thing that we can guarantee that every single human being is eventually going to have a conversation with another human being. And if you do that often enough, you're eventually going to have a tense conversation with another human being. And the more emotionally intelligent we can be, and the more we can be equipped to handle different levels of agitation and aggression, then the less needless violence we will have. So I think that's essential. But that's me. That's me getting off my soapbox about why we need to train people to manage conflict. And obviously, it's something I'm passionate about because I'm running a podcast called the Managing Violence Podcast. However, one of the things that a lot of organizations do as a knee-jerk response to wanting to manage this issue of violence and aggression is they immediately seek out training. Now, there's two common ways this can play out. Either they try to find someone on staff who can deliver the training, which is nearly always an unmitigated disaster, because they'll find the guy or the girl who did some martial arts classes. Maybe Tony the gardener is a 3rd-degree black belt in karate and everyone thinks he's a lethal weapon, and they're going to get him to teach some self-defense to whichever staff members they think are at risk, which I'm sure all my risk management audience are currently burying their head in their hands about the uncontrolled risk in that scenario. But it isn't uncommon that you get someone who's on staff who has some sort of experience who suddenly tapped on the shoulder and said, "Hey, can you teach people how to defend themselves?" I've seen this a lot with ex-police in the workforce. "Oh, you were a police officer. You must know a lot about managing crime and keeping people safe and conflict communication. So can you run a workshop for us?" That is really uncontrolled. It could be brilliant. Maybe the guy's an absolute gun. Maybe he's fantastic, but there's a very good chance that he's not. And there's a very good chance that even a well-meaning person will deliver a very subpar outcome compared to a professional in the field. So that's one possibility. The second possibility is they hire an external expert consultant for a training day. So this would be someone like myself or one of my competitors who will get a random email inquiry saying, "We're interested in a staff safety day," or "We'd like to do some personal safety education or some conflict management or some self-defense," or whatever it is it's going to be. So they'll reach out and they say, "We've got budget to do a 3-hour workshop," or if we're really, really lucky, maybe it'll be a full day workshop. But more than likely, it's going to be either a 2 to 3 hour PD session, or it's going to be a optional day of training that people can choose to attend or not attend. So that's usually the limitations with that. Now, that is more common, thankfully, than the tap on the shoulder to Tom the gardener. However, it doesn't always pan out the way you would hope. So the issue with ad hoc training, even if I come in and give you all my best stuff, if I give you an absolute best-in-class workplace violence and aggression training session, at best, you're going to remember about 30 to 40% of what I told you. Okay? And that's immediately afterwards. Give it 6 months or 12 months. If there's no revision in place, then you might remember 1 or 2 things. And to be honest, if I came back 12 months later and you were telling me that you remembered 1 or 2 things that I taught you, I would take that as a massive win and a pat on the back to me as a trainer. Because realistically, we, especially if it's professional development training, you get inundated with so much training, so much information, so many lectures, so many webinars, that it's impossible to hold on to that material if it's not something that you think about regularly. And the chances of you thinking about it regularly, if you're not in a high-risk situation or there's no refresher training programmed, is pretty minimal. So chances are that investment, while it was good and probably boosted morale and probably gave some people some cool skills to have in the short term, it's probably not going to make a real big difference for at an organizational level. So what I always recommend is that instead of engaging me for a once-off, let's do a once-off launch and let's have some sort of ongoing commitment, whether it's a 6-monthly hour-long session, whether it's online training that recaps the key points and that people sit through and they do for 10 minutes, once a quarter or once every 6 months or whatever it is that you have budget and appetite for. Let's create some sort of ongoing program so people can touch base with the material again, so they can revise it and keep it front of mind, because like anything else, being able to manage conflict is a perishable skill. And the less you think about it, the less you do it, then the quicker the skill degrades. So it's very important that you don't just choose someone for a day because you've got allocation, you've got 5 or 10 grand in the budget, and we need to be able to do this in one day because there's no recurring funding. That isn't really going to accomplish what you're after. It might achieve something, but it's probably not going to be the silver bullet you're looking for. You need to look at an ongoing commitment to making this happen. And that's going to happen over an extended period of time with a well-structured training plan, combined with other elements, as we'll get into in the following points. So make sure that you're not looking at training as an ad hoc venture, certainly not with your internal resources, unless you happen to have an actual expert who's been vetted and approved and assured to deliver the training. But even with an external expert who may have all those qualifications, it should be an ongoing approach, not ad hoc once off. All right. The third point to mention is implementing engineering controls or tech controls that are not supported by proper explanation or training. So this is something I see quite often as I'm consulting. More cars going past. I hope that's not too audible. But no, one thing I see quite often is we see this cycle play out where an issue has been ignored or hasn't been acted upon, and then all of a sudden we have a big incident which maybe gets a lot of publicity. Maybe someone is hurt or threatened, or it, God forbid, someone gets killed, and there's a lot of media coverage. And all of a sudden there is a scrambling that takes place to try and implement some sort of visible controls so that we can mitigate the reputational and brand damage and the morale damage more so than the physical damage. So one of the things that happens during this scramble is quite often an investment in some sort of engineering control or some sort of technology-based control. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So one of those reasons is that nearly every facility manager on the planet has a drawer full of brochures of engineering controls, of CCTV, of duress buttons, of monitoring systems, of personal safety devices, of apps. Or they've got a drawer full of brochures for different software that's apparently going to solve this problem for them. And the reason they have that drawer is because they're constantly inundated with salespeople from organizations trying to sell them this stuff. So when they're suddenly under pressure to come up with a solution, the first thing they do is they open that drawer and they dig out the brochures and have a look at what looks good. That's part of the reason. The other reason is this is very time sensitive, and they need to get some sort of actionable response, some sort of visible actionable response that has taken place. And it is much quicker to be able to point to a new system that's been installed, or a duress button that's been rolled out, or a pendant or something like that, and say, this is what we've done, versus starting a training initiative, which you will not be able to show real data for at least a couple of months, if not a year, or a cultural change project, which is really what needs to happen. But a cultural change project across a large organization can take 12 months, 3 years, even 5 years for a very large organization. So when you look at that, it's very hard to say, well, this is what we've done in response, because by the time you've actually realized the benefit of those programs, the media coverage has died off and no one cares again. So being able to implement an engineering or a tech control is very, very short. It's a very short turnaround time. I can make a phone call to a duress company today, and I'll probably have the devices in my hand within a couple of days or a week, and I can roll them out to the staff, and now I've actually done something, and next time someone breathes down my neck, I can say, this is what I've done about the problem. So engineering and tech controls are very attractive from that point of view. But if I use an example of what happens when a tech control or an engineering control is rolled out without explanation, you'll see why this is a bit of an issue. So I'm just going to take a hypothetical example of some home-based social workers. So people that go out to clients' homes, people that go out to clients' homes to check on them, do variety of care services, welfare checks, maybe counselling, whatever. They're doing home-based home-based care. Now, let's just say this organisation, we'll call them Acme Social Care, they've had some sort of incident. They're now in a panic. So they need to equip their staff with something to protect them. So the first thing they do is they pull out a brochure on duress pendants. So little pendants that staff can wear around their neck, and they can hit a panic button and help will come. So they lodge a purchase order for 100 duress pendants for their 150 strong workforce. And that allows one pendant for every staff member that's in the field plus a few spares, right? So the idea is that when staff are sent out in the morning, they'll each have a pendant. They'll bring it back to charge overnight and will be much safer because of it. Now, the workers themselves often have no knowledge that this is happening. They just show up to work one morning and there's a desk full of little black devices sitting in front of them, and they've been told, wear these around your neck. And maybe they have a company operations manager who comes in, he gives a 5-minute overview of the device. This is how to activate it if you're in trouble. Here's a phone number you call if you have any technical difficulties. And now you're safe. Good luck. Of course, half the staff will miss that briefing because they're running late, or they're in the bathroom, or they're still getting coffee and they missed the essential 2 minutes of information they were going to be given. But what the hell? The next shift will get the same briefing over again, and surely we'll catch them at some point. And that's the extent of the training. So, being good soldiers, all the staff put on their duress pendants, they head out to start work, and then they start to realize they have a bunch of questions. So, look, how do I know if the button has worked? Does it light up? Does it flash? Does it make a noise? Is someone going to call me to verify? Who's going to come? Is it going to be police, or is it going to be security, or is it just going to be a phone call? Or when should I press the button? Is it like how long do I have to wait? If someone's raising their voice at me, is that a time to press the button, or do I have to wait for them to actually threaten me, or do I have to wait to be assaulted? When is it okay to press the button? And is it going to be an issue if I press the button and nothing happens? Like, what if I press the button and the situation is nothing, and then the police come? Am I going to be embarrassed or shamed because I pressed it too early? Or what if I press it too late and they don't get there in time? Or and what are the consequences for the client? If I press the button and the police come, are they going to be taken to jail? Because I don't want my client to go to jail. I know sometimes they get angry and I get concerned, but I don't necessarily want them to go to jail every time that happens. And I don't want them to be in trouble. And how long is it going to take for someone to get here anyway if I need help? Like, there's so many questions that haven't been addressed because the training hasn't been sufficient. So because this doubt builds up, and because wearing the pendant isn't habitual, quite often what ends up happening is the pendants will get left in vehicles during the visit, so they're useless anyway. Or they'll get put in a handbag, or they'll get tucked away somewhere. If I need it, I'll go get it, which obviously defeats the purpose of a wearable pendant. But this is what happens. And then because of that, they're sometimes not accounted for at the end of the shift because they're still in a vehicle, or they're tucked away in someone's personal belongings. And therefore, when staff come the next morning, there's not enough to go around. People say, it doesn't matter anyway, we never use them. And eventually you have zero uptake of the technology. You have no one using it. And eventually you're back to where you started. And it's all because there was no education built around these devices. It's because there was no culture built around the devices. And it's just been a very, very expensive ordeal. And it's done very little to make staff any safer. So if you're going to roll out an engineering or a tech-based solution or a treatment, then you need to account for the myriad of human factors that are ultimately going to determine the overall effectiveness of the control. So buying stuff does not work if you don't teach the people who have to use the stuff why they need to use it, how they have to use it, and answer the questions they have so that they believe in it, they trust in it, and it becomes part of their routine. So that mistake is using tech or engineering-based controls without sufficient training and explanation. All right, the fourth one. This one is going to ruffle some feathers, I think. And I say that because even as I was plotting it, I started to second guess myself a little bit about what I was trying to communicate. So bear with me. But the fourth mistake I see is championing the warhorse and minimizing low-grade exposure. So what do I mean by that? It's a two-header. It's something that is unavoidable, that if you do the first thing, the second thing will follow. And what I mean by championing a warhorse is making someone a hero about what they've overcome. Now, look, all human beings love a good hero narrative. We want to support the leader who fought through adversity and suffering and anguish and despair and hardship. The person who soldiered on because their sense of purpose, because their why was just so strong and they couldn't quit because they had a team to support and had lives to save. And we love that stuff. It's a tale as old as time. I grew up in the martial arts. I grew up on warrior culture. I love the stories of the Spartans. I love the samurai. I love that ethos of discipline above all else. I love that modern, that ancient culture of the warrior who sacrifices themselves for the benefit of others. And I love the way that's played out in all of humanity. And look, I think deep down, we're all inspired by individuals that, there's almost like their deeds hint to our own internal capacity to endure. So because of that, we're always going to be drawn to those stories because it illustrates to us that we're capable of more than what we think we are. And there's nothing wrong with that for a second. The issue is, at an organizational level, we have to be really careful about what behaviors we champion and we celebrate. Because we don't want to be seen to be celebrating those who willfully engage in behaviors that increase their risk in unhealthy ways. So in the medical community, for example, I've seen this a lot working in hospitals. We revere a doctor that works 20 hours straight, or a surgeon who does inhuman hours to save lives, to be available in times of crisis, etc., despite the fact that we are categorically and painfully aware that the chance of catastrophic mistakes increase dramatically with fatigue and sleep deprivation. So why are we creating a culture that encourages young doctors to put themselves in that situation? Or the nurse that gets punched by a patient and she continues to finish her shift despite a splitting headache. We celebrate her toughness and her commitment and her willingness to push on and not be a victim. And certainly dedication, toughness, perseverance, they should be celebrated. Absolutely. But do we want our young doctors pushing themselves through exhaustion so they can emulate their heroes and potentially make catastrophic mistakes that end up with patients dying on the table? Do we want our nurses to continue working and making critical decisions while they're dealing with a head injury? Yeah, we've got to be so careful with the messages we send, because by celebrating some actions that look categorically heroic, but when we celebrate those, we also subtly ignore or condemn others who haven't been able to persevere through those. So, for example, how often do we champion a worker who was spat upon at work and months later they sought counselling when they realised they were angrier at home than they were before? Someone who went through some form of abuse, wasn't okay, realised they weren't okay, sought out their employee assistance program at work, went through a course of counselling, and then got better. Is that a narrative that we hear trumpeted? Is that a narrative that we put in our marketing materials? No, it's not. But isn't that the behaviour that we'd want to be championing? Isn't that the one that we want to be putting to our workers as this is an exemplary use of the resources available to you? This is a person who took their safety seriously. They weren't okay. They got counselling. Now they're fine. I've never seen that marketing campaign. And unfortunately, that's the one that needs to be celebrated, not the person who put themselves in harm's way, not the person who took the great risk and pulled it off. And there is an element of that is counterintuitive for the human psyche. And there's an unfortunate secondary effect of worshipping those who survive horrible ordeals as well, in that it serves to minimise the effects of lesser traumas. So even though it's completely unintentional, what we're almost communicating is, oh, you were yelled at? That's nothing. Susie was spat on last week and she just wiped it off. Or you're punched in the stomach. Oh, that's bad. But, Derek had his tooth knocked out and he didn't even miss a shift. Or, oh, you're traumatized because someone threatened you. Yeah, I guess that would have been scary. But, I know someone who was held up at knife point and she was fine. And even though we would never deliberately minimize someone's suffering, that's what the message of championing, I can't say that word today for some reason, celebrating someone else's survival sends to those who feel like they've gone through something lesser and are more impacted by it than the person who went through something severe. So we need to be so careful about what message we're sending to those that are paying attention. Okay. Number 5 is not allocating sufficient post-incident capability. So, look, most organizations, when they start to get serious about building capacity to manage workplace aggression or violence, they quite rightly focus on the before and the during phases. So we take a before, during, after approach. They focus on the before and the during. And look, I'm all about the prevention. I wholeheartedly agree that majority of your resources need to be allocated to the prevention and the preparation stages for managing the risk, because that's where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. That's where your outcomes are going to be the best. You don't want to be really, really good at bouncing back from incidents if you could have prevented them in the first place. That makes all the sense in the world. But sometimes the aftermath is completely ignored. So looking at what is our capacity to actually get back to normal after an incident. Things we need to consider in that world, things like, do we have support or counselling services available for our staff that have been affected? Do we have an EAP or employee assistance program? How robust is it? Do we have enough resources available? If we had an active shooter that came through our building, there's going to be a lot of traumatized people. Whether they were there, whether they weren't there, even if they just heard about it, even if they're on their day off, we're going to have a lot of traumatized people coming back to work. Do we have surge capacity to deal with that level of emotional stress? Do we have the ability to continue business operations if we have 60% of our workforce unable to come to work for the next 2 months? What's our plan there? Really, that's what it comes down to. What's our plan? What about support for people that might have been just witnesses? So maybe you have members of the public, or you have clients or customers that were witness to violence or aggression. Let's take active shooter situations off the table, but maybe you've had a violent incident take place in your waiting room and you've had people that were affected by it. Do you have resources to share with them if they need counselling and support services? It wouldn't be unusual for there to be legal action taken about not providing a safe place of work, or not providing a safe environment if you don't have some sort of precautions in place. So just be aware of that. What's our capacity to deal with trauma that may be inflicted upon people that aren't part of our staff? Do we have a responsibility there? I'm not sure. I'm not a legal counsel, but it's a question to ask. Also, what resources do we have to manage any brand or reputational damage? So if this incident is recorded, and let's face it, the majority of incidents are recorded, whether it's on someone's mobile phone or whether it's through leaked CCTV or whatever it is, there's going to be some sort of recording, or there's going to be some sort of at least social media activity about it, that people are going to talk about it. So there's going to be a certain element of brand or reputational damage to be considered. It depends on how it was handled, how it looked, and remember, how it looked and how it actually transpired are two different things. So you'll be judged on the most sensational 6 seconds of footage that gets leaked to the media, not the full 2-minute clip. So just keep that in mind. How are we going to manage that brand or reputational damage? These are all organizational considerations. Do you have a legal team to support your staff? So if you had an incident where your staff restrained someone who was being aggressive or violent, and then that person's family decided to press charges on your staff or take civil action against your organization, do you have a legal team that's equipped to deal with that? Obviously, large organizations typically do, but smaller organizations typically don't. So do you have the capacity to defend your staff, or that throw them to the wolves and saying, sorry, you're on your own now? So we need to take into consideration all those sort of factors. And then what I touched on earlier is internal investigative capacity. So a lot of organizations I've worked with over the years, that they really have a reluctance to involve police unless there's been a serious assault. So if it's not something where the staff member in question is going to press charges, they don't want to involve the police, and two, if there's no charges to press, the police aren't going to be involved anyway. But that doesn't mean an investigation shouldn't take place. Anytime that there is a near miss or there's been an injury, there should be some sort of investigation. Under Australian law, we have to with workplace health and safety legislation. So we need to make sure that you have the capacity to investigate this issue fully. Now, often that will fall upon your WHS investigation teams, so it's your occupational health and safety, work health and safety, depending what country you're in. They'll take that responsibility, but being able to investigate a criminal act is a different skill set than investigating a safety incident. So do you have the capacity to do that? Do they have the necessary expertise to identify what the key learnings were from this incident or suggest controls for the future management of these kinds of incidents? So you may or you may not, but if you don't ask the question, you won't know. And the reality is that if you don't have resources planned before an incident occurs, you're kidding yourself if you think that you're going to find them while you're in the middle of a crisis. So you need to make sure that you have these ducks lined up, even if you don't have them on staff, if you don't have the budget to have a legal team on retainer. At least know who you're going to call and know that they're going to have the capacity to help you when that situation visits you. Because trying to figure it out in the heat of the moment or in the immediate aftermath of a crisis is going to be a really, really bad day at the office. So make sure that you have your post-incident capability dialed in before you need it, not after you need it. Okay, moving on to number 6. This is probably the second biggest frustration for me, and that is the assigning of the workplace violence program or project to the incorrect person. Who is the incorrect person? Well, it usually is whoever draws the short straw, to be honest. It's another one we can really chalk up to good intention but poor execution. An organisation decides they're going to take workplace violence seriously. They're going to stand up a team to deal with it, or they're going to create a portfolio for it, and it's going to be someone's responsibility to manage those initiatives. All good so far. What usually happens is that they try to find somebody who's already within the organisation who can take on the responsibility of managing violence and aggression as well. Now, I've seen that fall in a couple of different ways. It can sometimes go to their security manager. That's a common one. So because security deal with criminal action on site, potentially they can also take care of aggression and violence, and that may work from a jurisdiction point of view. Sometimes it'll fall on the health and safety team because it involves staff safety and welfare and mental health, etc., and that can potentially work. Or sometimes it'll be thrown on HR because it involves an element of training and employee welfare, etc. So sometimes the HR division will end up taking ownership of it. And it really depends on the personality and the culture of each individual division as to how the workplace aggression program will fly. Quite often I see if it's been run by a security division, there'll be a heavy emphasis on verbal de-escalation training and then physical self-defense and situational awareness. If it's been run by a health and safety department, quite often I'll see a big emphasis on reporting and policy and procedure. And if it's been run by HR, quite often there'll be a big emphasis on emotional intelligence and mental health, first aid, etc., etc. So it is interesting how these programs kind of shake out when you see them run by different divisions. But what I want to put my finger on here is who is the right person to run it. Now, just because someone is a security manager doesn't mean that they have any idea at all about the intricacies of aggression and violence. I've worked with some brilliant security managers over the years that have no idea about people. They're very good at systems, they're very good at processes, maybe they're very good with technology, maybe they're excellent at managing manpower, but they really don't know how to deal with aggression and violence because it's not a skill set that they've ever learned and never really needed. Just because someone's in HR doesn't mean that they know how to talk about violence. If they've never encountered it, they can't talk about it with any authority. And same for someone in safety. They might know how to keep people safe from general obstacles, but customer aggression is a different thing. And I use the analogy that you can have, so let's say a large organization usually has some sort of fire advisor or a fire trainer who does the fire requals, runs fire drills, evacuation drills, and teaches people how to use extinguishers, etc. You wouldn't put that person in charge of your business continuity division unless they had some kind of relevant experience or education in that field. Yet they do know a little bit about how to manage a crisis, so they've got some related expertise, but we certainly wouldn't put them in charge of business continuity straight off, right? They've got tangential experience. They've got some skills that may match up, but chances are there's still a pretty big gap. And that's unfortunately what we do with managing violence and aggression. We take someone who has tangential skill sets in training or safety or situational awareness or verbal de-escalation, and we say, you're in charge of this project now. But what we're doing by that is we're actually devaluing the whole project by saying this is not a specialized skill set. Anybody can do it. And reality is that managing violence and aggression is a specialized skill set. It is a growing skill set. It is something you need to stay on top of. The same way I'll never be a cybersecurity expert, because by the time I caught up, the world of cybersecurity would have evolved so far past me that I'd continually be playing catch up. You can't play catch up on something like managing violence and aggression unless it's going to be your number one occupation, because it is a massive field and there's so much to know to do it well. What I would suggest is that if you don't have the resources to bring someone externally full-time or to hire someone, then look at a program where you can get an external consultant to come in to help guide you through your initial phases. That can coach and mentor someone that you've identified to bring them up to speed, and then work to build internal capacity in a structured manner going forward. So whether it be over the next 12 months, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is. But don't just throw someone in the deep end and hope that they swim, because it's a recipe for disaster. Okay, the last point, probably my single biggest frustration. Accepting it is just part of the job. This one frustrates me so much because it's a denial. It's weird. It's like an acceptance and a denial. It's acceptance that it's going to happen. It's a victim mentality of there's nothing we can do about it. And it's denial that there's any responsibility to do something about it, because it's always going to happen and there's nothing we can do about it. It's just part of the job. Get on with it. And I came across that, obviously, in my early days working as a bouncer in nightclubs. We accepted that getting into fights was part of the job. And, look, to some extent, I won't say it's part of the job, but it was a common risk. It was a common experience. Is it possible to do that job without getting into fights? Yes, it is. I know people that have done it. Can you do it well without getting into fights? Yes, you can. Will violence visit you eventually? Probably. So, is it still part of the job? No, but it's a risk that we control like any other. Now, accepting it's just part of the job puts your head in the sand and goes, well, you know what? If you can't handle being spat on, then you need to change industries. Or if you can't handle being knocked unconscious by a guy who's on meth, then you're in the wrong place. And that is just absolutely ridiculous, especially when you're talking about service industries. I don't know any nurse who got into nursing because they couldn't wait to be bitten by someone with hepatitis. But I've heard people say that's part of the job. It's part of the job that you get spat on. It's part of the job that you get abused. It's part of the job that someone follows you to your car and threatens you. It's part of the job that you need to be mindful that the people you're dealing with may try to infect you with a life-changing illness if they don't like you. That is not in anybody's position description anywhere, and we need to kill that attitude. I've even heard stories, and thankfully not firsthand because I don't know how I would have reacted, but I've heard stories of, I won't say what industry because I don't want to incriminate anybody, but I've heard stories of a female staff member being sexually assaulted as part of her job, being sexually assaulted during the course of her job and being told, get on with it, it's just part of your job. And that wasn't that long ago. That was less than 15 years ago. So consider that attitude and how toxic that is, and you see why it's such an issue. If you have a culture of it's just part of the job, get on with it, then you are never going to address the issue because there's never going to be an impetus to address the issue. All you're trying to say is survival of the fittest, don't like it, get out. And that's not a way to grow. It's not a way to make people safer. All it does is it makes your group more exclusive and it makes them colder and harder. And at the end of the day, it lessens the standard of care or the standard of service you're providing because the people that are left are going to be jaded because they're being spat upon and they're being punched and they're being abused and they're being threatened. So if you're in a service-based role, then how good a service is that person going to be given after 6 months, 12 months, 3 years of that kind of treatment? We need to treat violence and aggression as the anomaly that it is, as the risk that it is, as a threat that it is, and start taking appropriate controls, appropriate actions to control that risk. We cannot put our head in the sand about it. We have a duty of care to our workers. We have a duty of care to our clients to make the environment around them as safe as we possibly can. It is not only a legal obligation, it also is a financial imperative. It's something that will increase your productivity. It's something that will increase your staff retention. It's something that will increase your morale. It's something that's going to benefit the business in every possible way, but not if you say being abused or being threatened or being assaulted is just part of the job. We need to take action to address this. And the only way to get started with that is to accept that it is not part of the job, that it is something we can control and something that we are going to and are committed to controlling. Okay. Well, that is my 7-point list of the 7 mistakes organizations make when tackling customer aggression. I hope that you got something out of it. I've enjoyed having a bit of a rant. Normally, when I've got a guest on, I don't get a chance to talk too much because I'm very cognizant of the fact that you tuned in to listen to the guest. But I enjoyed the opportunity to get up on my soapbox on this particular occasion. If you'd like to hear more of these sorts of shows, be sure to let me know because I'm happy to do them. I've got a couple of cool guests coming up. I've just organised to do some interviews the next couple of weeks with Aaron Malden from AS Solution, who's an executive protection expert, so it's a bodyguarding expert. Aaron's got a pretty cool story and a couple of cool businesses to talk about. And also James Hamilton, who is Senior Vice President of Gavin DeBecker and Associates, another executive protection firm. And James also has a 3-decade career in the FBI before joining Gavin DeBecker and Associates. So we'll be talking a lot about threat assessment, risk assessment, and how these two individuals protect people at risk, and the lessons that we can take from that field to make our own personal lives and family lives safer. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Again, apologies for the delay. I'm doing my best to stay on top of things, and I look forward to talking to you very, very soon.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Managing Violence Podcast. For more information or to listen to previous episodes, please check out www.joesaunders.com.au or visit us on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Don't forget to rate and subscribe so you never miss a show.